Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here. Yeah, I'm happy to share a little bit about neuroeconomics and sort of the story behind the birth of neuroeconomics as a field, the tools that we use in neuroeconomics, and what kind of things we study. So, neuroeconomics is actually just what it says. It's a merging of economics with neuroscience. So I'm not a trained neuroeconomist. I'm actually a trained cognitive neuroscientist, but I study a lot of different things that fall under the penumbra term of neuroeconomics. So, economists have been around for, let's say, 100 years or more, and they have been studying all sorts of things about the way humans make decisions. And a lot of the interest has been in understanding the conditions or the boundary conditions of, let's say, rationality or negotiation or strategy. And in particular, there's a subfield in economics called game theory. And what game theory tries to do is understand how two people interact to solve some sort of problem. So the problem might be cooperation, the problem might be negotiation, the problem might be punishment. And what you can do with game theory is you can construct these little mini games between two people or three people or four people. You give them a bunch of different rules that sets the boundaries of the game of what you can and cannot do. And then you watch what happens when the two or three or four people play. And what game theorists have found over time is that people don't act rationally at all. People are very irrational. So a common early assumption in the field of economics was that if you were given a sum of money, you would do all that you could to maintain that sum of money or to maximize that sum of money. And what people quickly realize, what economists quickly realize, is that people don't do that. They have a lot of concern for other people. They have concerns about equity and about fairness, and if people don't behave fairly, about punishing those people. And people are even willing to give up their own money to punish somebody else if they've behaved unfairly. And so in the last, I would say, 30 years or so, there's been a sort of a seismic shift towards understanding that all these assumptions that came to the table in the early years of the tradition of economics didn't really bear out when it came to interacting with other people. So about 20 years ago, neuroscience came onto the scene, and we had all these magnificent tools to study what was happening in the brain. Primarily, we have functional magnetic resonance imaging, which is when we put somebody in the scanner and we see what types of activity happens in the brain given a certain choice or a certain circumstance that they might be in or find themselves under. And so what happened is that the field of game theory and economics met neuroscience, and they said, okay, why don't we see what happens in the brain when people make decisions about fairness, about cooperation, about altruism, and see if we can sort of pinpoint let's say, type of brain activity that's happening for these specific types of decisions. And so for the past 20 years or so, this sort of nascent field that was, just blooming in the early 2000s has really taken full steam. Now, it's not a full-fledged field in the sense that one wouldn't get a degree in neuroeconomics. But what you can do is you can work in the field of neuroeconomics. So typically people who work in this field are either neuroscientists by training or economists by training, and then they basically co-opt methodologies from the field that they have not been trained in, and they marry them with their own specific training. And so I myself, I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, but I study social phenomenon like cooperation and altruism and morality. And I find that game theory is a really wonderful way to test how people make these decisions because it enables us to have precision in a very nebulous field. So for example, how do we even define morality? What is an emotion? Everybody's idea of what emotion is different. And so we struggle a lot in the laboratory to pin down these really nebulous terms. And one wonderful thing about game theory and neuroeconomics is that it gives this level of precision. It enables us to use math and money, something that we universally value, to understand why people are making the decisions they do about cooperation, altruism, and so forth.
So I have a question about this. When you talk about questions of morality and making decisions, I know where my where my morality comes from. It comes from my mother. So I hear my mother when I'm making any decision that is at all a little bit questionable. I hear my mother talking, in my brain, telling me that's not the right thing to do. Does that have to do anything with my decision making? The fact that it's the morality of my mother, the one that dominates my decision making.
Yes, absolutely. So our early developmental years leave a big imprint on our brains for how we behave. So we are taught the rules of the land, and the rules of the land are different depending on who raises you. So there's a lot of work that looks at what sort of rules or constructs people grow up with and how that determines their morality. There's a whole other field that looks at what babies are born with, what types of morality babies are born with. And they find that even in the earliest years, even 6-month-old babies show signs of being altruistic. So one of the famous studies that was published in Nature in around 2005, 2006 showed that if you seat babies in front of a little puppeteer system, right? So there's little puppets, there's a bunny, and there's an elephant, and they're each trying to do their own thing. They're trying to push a ball up a hill. And let's say the elephant is trying to whack the ball down a hill and prevent the bunny from moving the ball up the hill. When you present the bunny, who is this good character, versus the bunny would, let's say, would help the other character push the ball up the hill, and the elephant would push it down. So you had a good character and a bad character. You present the 6-month-old infant with these two characters: the altruistic one, the good one who is a helper, and then the bad one who is not helping. And time again, 6-month-old infants who are not yet speaking reach for the altruistic character. And so what this shows is that even before you have your mother telling you, you're encoding all of this information about what to do, what not to do in the moral sphere, we already have an idea, and we're drawn to those that are good, those that are altruistic, versus those that are harming us or trying to prevent us from doing things.
So everybody's good until somebody just messes us up. Is that what you're saying?
Until someone's mother says otherwise.
Timmy, do we have any questions?
To follow up on that question, so how does authority play a role? So, the mother's kind of authority at the beginning, but then as you grow up, a lot of people don't do things because there's authority telling them not to do it, but not because they don't want to do it. And second part to that question is, how do you then, as you get older, how do you combine all these things of like what you want versus what authority says versus what your models, what you learned growing up and your religion? How do you pick when to use one and what combinations to?
Right. So that's a very interesting question. So in the field of moral psychology and moral neuroscience, there's some work that has explored actually the intersection of politics with concepts like authority and purity and fairness. And what some researchers have found is that Republicans, as opposed to Democrats, care more about authority, where Democrats care more about fairness and equity. And harm concerns. So in these types of studies, what they're looking at is what we call individual differences. So people who highly value listening to authority, making sure that all the rules are followed, and so forth, versus people who care about how the cake is divided. Is it divided into equal pieces, or is somebody getting a larger slice of that cake? And it's very interesting because if you apply it to politics or political psychology, what you find is that it looks like these, two major groups in our American system divide along moralistic lines in some way on this caring about authority on the one hand versus fairness and harm on the other hand. They've also looked inside the brain to see what happens when you make decisions like this about authority and fairness and harm. And so this comes to your second question, Timmy, is how do you integrate all these things? So one of the beautiful things about neuroscience is we can see how different parts of the brain activate to different components of this morality question. So where does fairness light up in the brain? Where does authority light up in the brain? And what happens when we have a tension against fairness for authority? Someone saying to do something, but my fairness barometer says do something else. And so the beautiful thing about neuroscience is that we can look inside the brain as you're weighing up these different tensions to try to focus in and identify and localize where in the brain it's making this decision. How is it integrating these various different tensions? And what part of the brain actually executes on that decision? Like where in the brain, usually here in the prefrontal cortex, right above your eyes, that's where the integration is happening. That's where value, the seat of value, so to speak, happens, where we actually say, okay, no, we care more about fairness, in my case, over, let's say, authority, or vice versa.
Very interesting. We have some questions from the audience, Timmy?
Yes, we do. Yes, so the question is, how do we define, this is a good one, how do we define what is universally morally acceptable behavior based on what we just talked about, culture, generations, and religious beliefs?
Right. We don't.
Yeah.
So, so this is, I mean, you know, I teach an upper level seminar at Brown called The Moral Brain. And the very first day of class, I ask people to get into groups and to define what is morality. And every single group that gets together defines morality differently. Okay, so these are people who are thinking about morality, who have deep interest in morality, who've read about morality, and they all have different ideas about morality, what morality is. And you know what? That mirrors what happens in the academic realm as well. So if you were to ask me as a moral researcher versus any other moral researcher, we would all come up with a different idea of what is moral and how do we define morality. There is not one universally agreed upon definition, and certainly not one that extends across all cultures. So there's some things that you might be able to say do transcend across cultures, and that is this idea of harm and fairness, that there are two pillars of morality that all people care about, and even animals that live in collectivist societies like chimps, monkeys, some rodents, they care about harm and even in fairness as well. So you see a lot of actually primate research showing that how much humans care about fairness actually extends to our relatives, to our primate relatives.
How does guilt play into all of this? You know, because sometimes we make decisions that are the wrong decisions. So for example, I go to the supermarket and the cashier gives me a $10 bill instead of a $1 bill. And we've all experienced this. And I bet you $1 million that sometimes we have walked away and sometimes we have stayed and told the cashier, you gave me the wrong change. How does guilt play into this, and what happens in the brain when you are guilty?
Yeah, so you're touching on a really important question in neuroeconomics and moral psychology in general, and that is the role of emotion. So emotion is a very powerful predictor of our choices in many different ways. And you bring up one, which is guilt, which is this anticipation of doing the wrong thing, or once you've done the wrong thing, feeling bad about it and seeking to repair that behavior. And so actually guilt is a very powerful moral or social glue. It helps keep communities together. It helps when you have made an error to repair that relationship. And it helps keeping, if you anticipate what an action might do and you have these feelings of guilt, it helps you not make that immoral action. So one of the subdomains of neuroeconomics is entirely devoted to understanding the role of emotion in decision making and how it basically acts as a sail on a sailboat, directing us in one direction versus another, depending on how the wind, which is the emotion, is going. So anything that makes us aroused, so like makes our heart beat or makes our hands sweat, that is a very powerful predictor of, let's say, avoiding something that is negative. And we do that for things like that are fearful, but we also do that for things that are moralistically wrong. So if we get that general arousal feeling in our body, of our heart beating quickly and our hands sweating, it says to us, oh, maybe I should not engage in such an immoral behavior.
And I bet it also justifies in our mind wishing bad to someone that deserves it. We get this sense of deservedness, or deserving something bad, even though we would never wish that to any other person.
Yeah, so the idea of, Schadenfreude, for example, is a powerful emotion where people want something bad to befall against, let's say, the outgroup or someone who treated them wrongly. Retribution for someone who behaved poorly, wanting to make sure that they get their just punishments, their just desserts, is also a very strong motivator behavior. Some interesting work that's come out of our lab is that in America, we have a very strong focus on punishment, right? So, the American legal system is all about punishing. And the literature for, 30 years in game theory showed that people have a really strong desire to punish. But the problem is, in a lot of these different cases in which we were looking at punishment, we were basically looking at whether people wanted to punish or do nothing. So people would be, be treated unfairly, and then they would say, okay, you can do nothing, or you can punish the person who treated you unfairly. So it's not a really rich option set, right? Like maybe there's some other thing that you want to do to restore to rebalance the scales of justice. You just don't have the option. And so when you give people other options that are not punitive in nature, so let's say you could compensate the victim, what happens is that people actually have a really strong desire to not punish the person who treated them poorly and to do something that was compensatory towards the victim. So this whole notion that, we're super punitive and that we desire this punishment retributive sense actually might be a little bit misguided. We might have a little bit less focus on it than we originally thought.
Interesting. We have a number of questions, Timmy.
Oh man. I'm excited about some of these questions. This is what I was thinking about. So one thing I think we can come back to my question, but let's answer that question is, do fMRIs from people that Republicans and Democrats, are they different when it comes to moral issue? Like what parts in the brain that light up, are they different when it comes to moral issue?
Yes and no. So if you're asking Republicans and Democrats in the scanner to make decisions about one thing, and one group cares about fairness and the other cares about authority, yes, you are going to see different brain activity for those two groups because they care about different things. But there's also research, including from our lab, that shows that two Democrat brains and two Republican brains, let's say who are on, really extremist ends of the spectrum, they're ideologues, they care a lot about, being leftist. They care a lot about being rightist. Those two brains look the same when they're processing information. So this idea of extremism is not just on the Republican or the Democratic side, but it actually looks very similar on both ends of the spectrum. So it a little bit depends on how you're studying the questions and what you're looking at. So that's not a totally satisfactory answer, but most of science is not.
Thank you. My question, the question I had about that was more like, okay, so that we know that can you train on Republicans? Because it seems like we don't hear each other out, right? If Democrats don't hear, Republicans out, Republicans don't hear each other out, Democrats out. Can you train both sides so there's a compromise somewhere?
Yes, it's hard, but there's some research that has done it successfully. And what that research shows is that if you get people to engage in a conversation, not to win, but to explain, you are more able to move the needle on their belief system than if you're trying to win the argument. And a lot of times when we go into these conversations with the opposing political side, we're there to win. How could you possibly think this? Let me tell you why I'm right, blah, 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 blah.
Especially online on Facebook.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So, but the research shows that if you try to explain your logic or why you've come to think about it the way you have, you're much more willing to get people to come more towards your side than the other way.
So we have a couple questions that has to do with COVID, the pandemic, in terms of both how the economy during the pandemic and also like public health decisions during during the pandemic. Can you just speak on those two things?
Sure. Yeah. So, um, the pandemic has provided a very interesting case of what happens to people in social isolation and how people follow norms and rules. So for much of the pandemic, there were not rules that were inscribed at, let's say, the federal or national level, but they were social norms: wear a mask out in public. And depending on your locale, you may or may not subscribe to those norms. And so what neuroeconomics has, shown us, both outside of the pandemic, but also inside the pandemic, is the power of conformity, and how if there's a social norm that people are wearing their masks a lot, out in the world, that other people will follow suit because that's what the local norm is. And yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of dynamics here that are at play that neuroeconomics can speak to. With the economy, that's a bit of a vague question, and it's not entirely my field. But if you ask me something more specific, I might be able to answer, maybe be able to answer it.
I think it was more of like, people making a decision of whether to spend or not, like just things like decisions that are made during the pandemic. I think that was what the question was kind of.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that, all of this comes down to what everybody's unique circumstances are and what their own tensions are, what they have to spend money, how they have to, make ends meet and so forth. And so, neuroeconomics in general speaks more to understanding sort of like in a more globalized fashion what's happening given a set of constraints.
We have another question that says, is there a connection between neuroeconomy and those that experience sociopathy or psychopathy?
Yes, there is. This is a favorite question. So, in general, if I'm speaking in very broad brushstroke terms, there is a group of individuals who would be classified as sociopaths, and surprisingly, maybe to some, is that if we were to administer a scale amongst the population widely, what we would find is that 20% of the population would come off very high on the psychopathy spectrum. And so it's actually much more dominant in the population writ large than one might think. And so usually the profile of someone who falls on the high end of the psychopathy spectrum are people who are very intelligent, usually have some sort of blunted emotionality. So when we talked about emotion being this, driver of our types of behaviors or moral behaviors, in those who are high end on the psychopathy spectrum, that emotional signaling is less prevalent or less strong, and that is reflected in the brain. So certain parts of the brain come online a lot less readily and are a lot less engaged in sociopaths than in a typical normal population.
That's a lot of people, 20%.
Yeah, sure is. We have one question that says, would it be appropriate to liken our psychological needs for punishment to our body's need for homeostasis?
What an interesting question. I think that would be a fair assessment of the literature maybe 10 years ago, but I think in the past 10 years, the literature and the evidence is starting to show that our need for punishment is not as strong as that. So yes, I think like as a colloquialism, as something that we talk about sort of generally, you could link our desire for punishing to this like natural state of homeostasis, but I think that's actually a very misguided analogy given the more recent evidence.
I'm still, at a loss with my problem with hindsight and making an economic decision that seems so absolutely perfect one day. And then, a week later, a month later, you look back and you say, oh my God, what was I thinking? So I'm still trying to figure out, what was I thinking?
Well, I think we all struggle with that. So you're not alone, Pablo.
It really is something that I have learned to control over the years, and I think it comes with age. That you get, like you said, emotions really affect your decision making in such a way that if you don't realize that you are being driven by emotion, then you commit the error that days later you regret. And recognizing the feelings, is the first thing that you need to do in order to be able to arrive at the right decision.
Yeah, so I would just say a little caveat to that, which is emotions often get a bad rap as being sort of, pushing us in the wrong direction. And I would argue that actually, we have the most amazing set of drivers, and that is emotion, telling us what to do in the right thing. And when you blunt that emotion, like in sociopathy, actually that's where you get the more difficult, more tending towards immoral types of decisions, and that we should actually let our emotions guide us in the way that they're meant to.
So I should give myself a break.
Yes.
That's great, because guilt also plays a big part in this. So when I judge myself, then I feel guilty that I make this decision. So now I'm going to be a little bit more calm about it and not get too upset. Tim, you have any questions?
Yeah, we have a couple more questions. I think one of them was, what about people with mental illness? So I think in terms of decision making, I imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
So that's also like a whole entire field where, we look at different groups or different populations who have, let's say, depression or anxiety or social anxiety. And we look at the effects of having that particular mental health disorder on decisions to, not necessarily make moral decisions, although sometimes, but also how do we trust people? Can we cooperate with other people if we suffer from, depression or anxiety? What does that do to the way that we engage with people? So that's a really rich field. It's an up and coming field. And there's a lot for us to explore there that we don't right now know very much about.
I like this next question. Is research on neuroeconomics going to change traditional economic theory?
Oh, no, the economists amongst us would put their foot down and say, no way. No, I think that yes, in some ways, because it's refocusing how we thought about some things like rationality. And I think that's good for the field of economics. But, the economists come from a very storied tradition, and they strongly believe in the ways that they believe. And I don't think that's going to change anytime soon.